Hi, I'm Dr. Craig Malkin, and welcome back to my podcast about my book, Rethinking Narcissism, the Bad and Surprising Good About Feeling Special. In today's episode, I'm going to be answering the question, what is narcissism? It's a hugely important question. It's the one that opens the book, really. And today I will be addressing and breaking some myths that you might have about narcissism, because most of us have them, and to understand where they come from, why they get in the way, and how in leaving them behind, we're actually going to be better prepared to protect ourselves from dangerous narcissism. That as soon as we start to think about narcissism in a different way, a whole lot of things become much, much clearer. So when most of us think of the word narcissism or narcissist, we tend to think of vain, preening, primping, boastful reality TV types. Donald Trump's name has been thrown around a lot. And people who love to hear themselves talk, who are kind of blowhards, and very often they might even be extremely charismatic. The problem is that not all narcissists care about looks or fame or money, and some can be extremely quiet. And if we are focused entirely on this one stereotypical image of narcissism and who narcissists are, we can miss signs of trouble that have absolutely nothing to do with, for example, how long somebody spends time preparing themselves in a mirror. There are clear signs of danger for narcissism. And when we get too transfixed by what's become a really popular image in the media and even in the blogosphere of who narcissists are, then we're not prepared, because we're looking for the loudmouth, grandiose, mean-spirited person, and that's not who shows up first. I mean, the other problem is people very rarely fall in love with complete jerks. As I mentioned in an earlier episode, the wonderful qualities, healthy aspects of narcissism and unhealthy coexist, and very often all you see are the good things up front. So we tend to have this image. And in solving the puzzle for myself of how to understand and even relate to my mother, because my interactions with her were often very upsetting, and I often felt very sad afterwards, and alternated between just not wanting to talk to her or getting enraged and sort of exploding at her. And I needed to find some way out of that, really that trap that so many of us get caught in. But I had to leave a lot of these assumptions aside. The first 3/4 of Rethinking Narcissism are really devoted to helping people understand and change their view of what's bad about narcissism. To recognize, for example, that some people who are extremely narcissistic pride themselves more on being the most misunderstood person in the room or the most self-sacrificing. There's a new type of narcissism and narcissist in the research called Communal Narcissism. And they actually agree with statements like, one day the world will know me for the for the good deeds that I have done. That is a kind of extreme narcissism. And if all you're focused on is the charismatic manipulator, you're not going to see it coming. So where did these ideas come from? Why do we have this image if there are so many different kinds of narcissism? And they have been known in the research for decades at this point, just not to the public. Where did these ideas come from? Well, one place they came from is in the early 80s. Some researchers decided to take the definition of narcissistic personality disorder I can get into that in more detail later, but for now, just think of it as people who, with narcissistic personality disorder, are so invested in standing out from the rest of the people, on 7 billion people on the planet, that they will lie, steal, cheat, they'll hurt, they'll exploit others, use them to get their needs met, be extremely demanding, and become impaired in their empathy and unable to understand the impact they have on others pervasively across their life. That's a good working, brief definition of narcissistic personality disorder. Some researchers named Raskin and Hall decided to adapt the definition of narcissistic personality disorder, which was actually relatively new at the time, and generate questions so that if people answered the questions, they could determine how narcissistic this person was. Initially, the idea was that perhaps this test would be used, and if people scored really high on it, you could figure out whether or not they have the most disordered form of narcissism, narcissistic personality disorder. But once the testing was done and once they saw how everything was turning out, they realized that this was not going to be the best test for narcissistic personality disorder, but it seemed to do a fairly good job of identifying obnoxious people who were more likely to retaliate when they felt like their ego was threatened, people who liked to primp and preen in the mirror, people who felt they were better than everyone else around them, and who tended to be extremely outgoing. And this became the Narcissistic Personality Inventory, which is one of the most popular tests that we have today. Around 2009, a psychologist named Jean Twenge, actually a colleague of hers named Keith Campbell, decided to analyze all of the data from the Narcissistic Personality Inventory over the course of the years since it had been invented, really with an eye towards seeing if narcissism had been on the rise. And they used the data to advance the argument that, yes, in fact, narcissism was getting more prevalent. It was on the rise, and in particular in millennials, people born after around 1980, because of social media, because of other changes in culture where people are more focused on themselves, more focused on them as themselves as individuals, and less focused on the group and less focused on caring. And that as a result of all of that, everybody was more narcissistic, particularly younger generation, which was declared the most narcissistic generation ever. The problem, there are a number of problems with this. First of all, the narcissistic personality disorder, the Narcissistic Personality Inventory has been analyzed and reanalyzed, and over again, there are parts of it, like when people answer questions like, I'm assertive, and they agree with that, or I'm a born leader. When they answer questions like that in the affirmative, they score higher and higher on the narcissism measure, and they supposedly they look worse and worse off. But the problem is when all of those questions are looked at individually, and you look at what they relate to all kinds of healthy things, like healthy relationships and people who are confident and can even be confident and caring. In other words, people started to see signs of what was later called, in the research, healthy narcissism. That is, people started to see evidence that feeling a little bit special, feeling like you maybe had some qualities that made you a little better than others compared to you on any number of measures like intelligence, warmth, curiosity, you name it, that actually related to some really positive qualities in people. and that those positive qualities could exist without all the nastiness, like somebody who liked to retaliate when they didn't like what they heard, when they got negative feedback. So a researcher named Ackerman revised all of this and said, well, actually, the narcissistic personality disorder inventory is measuring both healthy and unhealthy aspects, and we really need to separate them out and look at them. But at that point, it was really too late. A narcissism epidemic had been declared. For the most part, people didn't think about or talk about narcissism that much before then. There was a book by a guy named Christopher Lasch, and Twengie's research really harkened back to this idea of the dangers of narcissism everywhere. He wrote a book called The Culture of Narcissism. And prior to the writing of his book, actually, the idea of healthy narcissism and the idea of narcissism being something that's sort of a part of human experience in all of us, this idea of feeling a little bit special and standing out from the rest of the 7 billion people on the planet, being something that's fairly inescapable and that doesn't in and of itself cause harm. That idea had been around for quite some time. It was really elaborated on a guy named Heinz Kohut. Kohut was a really interesting man because he was extremely intelligent. He was an extremely compelling speaker. He could rattle off client sessions and give entire lectures without having a single note card to prompt him. He did all this from memory. It was extemporaneous. He was known for being one of the most amazing speakers, and he really changed how people thought about narcissism and what unhealthy narcissism was. And he actually introduced the first disorder of narcissism, narcissistic personality disorder. But he had this idea that we all sort of grow up with a little bit of a need to feel special, particularly that we need our parents to view us as special. And that's part of developing a healthy sense of self. And throughout our lives, we turn from that to time to time. But he had a contemporary who was a little bit younger than him, who grew up in Nazi Germany, a guy named Kernberg. And, he grew up during the Nazi occupation of Austria. And he had to flee with his family to Chile when he was very young. But he saw the damage that an extreme megalomaniac could do. And I think as a result of that, and also as a result of just his different way of thinking about things, he felt that really what we should be most focused on are the dangers of narcissism. That is when it becomes completely out of control, so that we're left with people who were sort of monstrosities who could care less about fellow human beings, who one of the metaphors I believe he used was they would use people up and squeeze the juice from them like a lemon and then cast them aside. Kernberg called these people malignant narcissists. What you should know is that Christopher Lasch drew on that image in his book. So the public's first introduction to narcissism at all was of this really scary idea of it. And Kohut's idea of this being a pervasive part of human experience that becomes disordered sort of faded into the background as a result, not due in no small part to Christopher Lasch's book. So now we have, together with that, the declaration of a narcissism epidemic in 2009, and all people have as an image is of a narcissist who is completely dominating and outgoing, maybe charismatic, deeply self-involved, vain, and quite dangerous. The problem is that even though the narcissistic personality inventory was meant to tap into the disordered part, again, it didn't really capture disorder. It captured both health and disorder, and the health could be quite healthy. But the other problem was that the narcissistic personality disorder tends to capture only one kind of narcissism and one kind of narcissist, very outgoing types. And we now know to this day, as you've probably experienced yourself, that not all people who are extremely narcissistic are particularly outgoing. So now we have this pervasive idea of the loud, obvious narcissist, again, the boastful reality TV types, and that's all we know of narcissism, and that's what's around today. And the problem is, again, if that's what you're focused on, you're not going to see trouble, because that is not what defines narcissism. Narcissism and unhealthy narcissism are not defined by looks or vanity or fame seeking or even being particularly outgoing. We have to understand narcissism a different way in order to protect ourselves from the dangers of it. And we can't do it if we don't leave that stereotype behind. So what we in fact know is that, in looking at the research, that there are also introverted narcissists. These are people who aren't particularly outgoing. They pride themselves on being sensitive. They'll answer questions like, I feel things more deeply than most people, or I'm more sensitive than most people, or I'm different than other people. They agree with statements like that. You can see this is not an outgoing person at all. But they can be just as argumentative, and they can be just as difficult to deal with in our relationships. I hinted earlier, I believe, in an earlier episode of the podcast, to communal narcissism, people who pride themselves on being the most helpful people in the world. So we have to rethink what's bad about narcissism if we want to spot trouble. But we also have to, in order to get there, in order to understand my dealings with my mother, and even understand my clients who struggle with narcissism a little better, we have to recognize healthy narcissism. Because over a quarter century of research shows that the vast majority of people around the world feel, at least privately, a little bit special. In one study, we appear as human beings to believe that we're more intelligent, warmer, more compassionate, even more human than other people around us, at least a little bit. And when we feel that way, when we feel a little bit special, not like we're the king of the world, but a little bit special, like we are exceptional or unique, to quote one researcher, we feel more optimistic, we feel happier. In our research, on which I'll get to in a moment, people are better able to give and receive in relationships, and they could be quite empathic. That is healthy narcissism. So the core rethink of Rethinking Narcissism that helps us understand what narcissism is, to tie all of this together, and when it becomes dangerous, is to think of narcissism as a pervasive, universal human tendency, the drive to feel special. And narcissists, and in particular, people with narcissistic personality disorder, are addicted to feeling special. They are, as I mentioned earlier, uncomfortable saying I'm scared, or I'm sad, or I'm lonely, because they do not trust people to be there for them, to depend on them. So extremely narcissistic people depend on feeling special instead of depending on love and caring and relationships. And in particular, they find many ways to feel special. This is why there's such a variety, and why we need not to get so focused on the loud, outgoing types, because then we miss the core of what drives unhealthy narcissism. Some people can feel special by feeling like they're extraordinarily helpful. Some might feel like they are special, stand out from the rest of the 7 billion people by being the most misunderstood or ugliest person in the room or on the planet. All kinds of ways to feel special. But what they all have in common is this attempt to stand out from others, to somehow distinguish themselves from the rest of the people around them, instead of turning to relationships for comfort and caring and concern. Much like a substance abuser or somebody who struggles with any kind of addiction, they soothe themselves with the experience of feeling special. And that is what defines unhealthy narcissism. Healthy narcissism you can think of as feeling slightly special, moderately dipping into this feeling of, at least privately, being exceptional or unique, just enough to feel energized, to have big dreams, to persist in the face of failure. But when people set aside all of their considerations in order to feel special, lie, steal, cheat, set aside honor, truth, love, that is when they become dangerous. That is when they become extremely narcissistic. And I mentioned this earlier, but it also explains narcissistic personality disorder and all the varieties we see of that. Because if you truly believe that all that matters is whether or not you stand out from everybody else, you'll do, and that is how you soothe yourself. That's your drug. You'll do whatever it takes to get there. So we have what I call triple E, exploitation, manipulating others to get our needs met, no matter what the cost, no matter how it affects other people, entitlement, acting like the world or other people owe them, and empathy impairment. It used to be thought that narcissists are incapable of empathy. It turns out that's more true of something called psychopathy, where people are not just dysfunctional in their capacity for empathy, but they might even have wired in neurological problems where they don't experience feelings in the same way. But what happens for people who are extremely narcissistic is they become blocked. They become preoccupied with their own needs. And suddenly, if they had empathy at the beginning of a relationship or you saw signs of it, that's when it vanishes. So it's best to think of narcissism along a spectrum. And most spectrums of narcissism, most of the time when we think about it, we think about degrees of bad. Just somebody is more and more obnoxious the higher they go on the spectrum. But in order to bring all this together and to account for healthy narcissism, I decided to start the spectrum. My colleagues and I even developed a measure for the spectrum that starts at 0 narcissism. People who are afraid of seeming narcissistic in any way, who live their life by the rule, the less room I take up, the better. I had a client once who was so uncomfortable with accepting help, accepting any special attention, anybody knowing what she needed, that even after her husband died, even though she lived out in the middle of nowhere, anytime anybody asked if they could bring her something or if she needed help with anything, she just said no. She told me, I don't want to be a burden. And that is the core fear of people who struggle with a lack of healthy narcissism, which I dubbed in the research echoism, based on the myth of Narcissus and Echo. Echo was the nymph who was cursed to repeat back only the last few words that she heard. And like Echo, people who struggle with echoism tend to struggle to have a voice of their own. And I should mention that Echo is the nymph who fell in love with Narcissus. Narcissus fell in love with his reflection. Echo fell in love with Narcissus. And again, like Echo, people who struggle with echoism struggle to have a voice of their own. They tend to set aside their needs and preferences. They worry about becoming a burden. They often are very self-blaming when anything goes wrong in a relationship. The last thing they want to do most of the time is stand out. In the milder range of egoism, people can be very extremely empathic and caring, but the danger here, what's dangerous, is that people who struggle with extreme egoism often fall in relationships with very narcissistic friends and partners. Before I understood this myself, before I understood that I sort of occupied that bottom range of the spectrum, I dated some of the most narcissistic people on the planet, really like appalling experiences. Or even friends. I remember I had a relationship with one person who I was waiting forever for her to meet me, to go out someplace, I don't know, it was a club or someplace like that. And in 2-3 hours into it, I finally pick up the phone and I call and I say, "Hey, what's going on? Where are you?" And she said that she got caught up. She was watching a movie, even though we'd already had plans. I mean, we weren't even dating, but this was supposed to be a friend, and we had plans that we made together. And then we're on the phone some more, and I'm talking to her about how I feel. I'm like, I had plans. This kind of blows up my whole evening. Are we doing this or not? And I noticed that she's distracted. And she laughs out loud. And I said, "Are you reading a book while we have a conversation?" And the answer was yes. I dated people like this too. And until I figured all of this out, I really, really struggled to have my own voice. I became very adept at blaming myself. Even in that situation, I was like, "Oh, I'm expecting too much. We're not romantically involved. I'm being needy here." I had ways of explaining all of it away. So that is an example of struggling with healthy narcissism. As a result of my mother's extremely narcissistic personality, I learned to echo her narcissism. I was exquisitely attuned to whatever she needed. I could be there in a snap. I could put towels on her head when she, even when I was very little, when she was sick. And she seemed to retreat into her room. She may or may not have had migraines, but I became her caretaker. I think everybody else is sort of fed up with what was going on, including my father and my brother. But I was tuned into everything, and I felt like I had a really close connection with her. So that is an example of egoism. And then that is in around the range of 0 to 3 on the spectrum. Think of the spectrum of running from 0 to 10. In 4 to 6 range, we find healthy narcissism. These are people who moderately enjoy feeling special, who score high on something called self-enhancement. This is cross-cultural research. Even people in Eastern countries apparently self-enhance. They just do it in different ways by feeling, again, like they're more giving or compassionate than everybody else when they compare themselves. People in the range of 4 to 6 can be very caring and empathic, but they also can be very ambitious and outgoing. They're not always outgoing. Some of them, when they are the type who sort of take the stage and make everybody feel great with them. You feel great when you're talking to them. But there are also quieter, more introverted people who occupy that middle range of the spectrum, who just have big dreams and they stick by them and they know how to pursue them. They might be artists or writers, but they're more introverted. So narcissism has nothing to do with being outgoing. And then what you can think of at the far extreme of the spectrum, where we're talking about the range of 7 to 10, this is unhealthy narcissism. These are people who've become dependent on or addicted to feeling special. They're so uncomfortable depending on people, of acknowledging vulnerability in any way, because they don't trust people to be there for them. They're often raised by extremely narcissistic parents themselves, or at the very least, they experienced abuse or neglect, just no sense that they could securely depend on anybody when they were in distress. So they turn to feeling special to comfort themselves, and they might turn to it addictively. And when it becomes addictive enough, when they set aside people and other people's needs and feelings so much so that they actually hurt others, that's when we're tipping into the range of disorder, or even something called malignant narcissism, which is a combination, a really dangerous combination of extreme narcissism, where the person is so likely to exploit others without giving it a second thought, that they have very little empathy, and they are psychopathic narcissists, extremely psychopathic narcissists. And people in relationships with extremely psychopathic narcissists can often suffer quite a bit. It's not unusual for malignant narcissists to be abusive, emotionally and physically abusive, so it can be quite dangerous. So if you are curious where you fall on the spectrum, the other thing that I wanted to do was provide people with a way of figuring that out. So my colleagues and I, Stuart Quirk, at Central Michigan University, and Shannon Martin, put together the Narcissism Spectrum Scale. You can find that in Rethinking Narcissism. And using the questions in the book, there are 30 questions in the book, you can locate yourself specifically on the range from 0 to 10. I give you ways of translating your scores on egoism, called insufficient narcissism in the book, egoism, and healthy narcissism and extreme narcissism, to place yourself on the spectrum and to see exactly where you fall. I also give you tips for what you can do to shift around on the spectrum, because my assumption, again, given that this is a habit that becomes addictive, is that we can break the habit. So you can, if you buy the book, you can take the longer form of the test, and that allows you to locate yourself specifically on the spectrum. If you want to take the brief online version, you can go to www.drcraigmalkin.com. That's DRCRAIGMALKIN as in Nancy.com. And you can take the test and get research-backed fit tips and feedback to know what to do if you are too high, if you're in extreme narcissism, how to get back to a healthier center. If you need to embrace some of that slight feeling of feeling special, I often also think of it as seeing yourself through slightly rose-colored glasses, because that's actually a great way to think about it. Turns out people who do see themselves through slightly rose-colored glasses also see their partners through slightly rose-colored glasses. That's another benefit of healthy narcissism. So I give all kinds of strategies in the book for how to do that. But if you go online, I give you a sample, a taste of how you can cope, and how you can change where you are on the spectrum. And I encourage you to check it out. So again, you can go to www.drcraigmalkin.com and take the test, the narcissism test. And if you would like to purchase the book already, again, I have plenty more I'm going to tell you. But if you'd like to purchase the book, you can go to www.drcraigmalkin.com, the book, and you can read more about the book. You can read all about the reviews from readers. I have links to Goodreads, so you can see what other readers have said about it, and the full list of peer reviews, both from mental health and psychiatric organizations, like Psych Central has a review on there, and from my colleagues and other experts and authors. So plenty for you to find. And there's also plenty of free tips and information always on my site, including videos on how to cope, how to spot dangerous narcissism, what to do when you see it. I encourage you to check it out. And I hope you'll stay tuned for my next episode 3, which is about the origins of narcissism, what causes it, where it comes from, how do we prevent unhealthy narcissism? And I hope you'll stay tuned for that. Thanks. And again, you've been listening to my podcast. I'm Dr. Craig Malkin, author of Rethinking Narcissism, the Bad and Surprising Good About Feeling Special. Take care.